I heard it before I saw it. A whisper, sharp as glass. Sell it before she finds out. The words came from my mother's lips, a hushed urgency, as though they carried both shame and thrill. She was seated at the kitchen table, her hand brushing the rim of her coffee cup, her eyes flicking to my sister across from her. They didn't know I had paused in the doorway. They didn't know I had already heard enough. The room smelled of brewed coffee and lemon polish, the same kitchen I'd walked through since I was a boy. But in that moment, it felt foreign a stage, where the people I trusted rehearsed lines against me. My mother's tone carried something more than simple business. It carried intent. And intent has a weight. I didn't move right away. Instead, I let the silence stretch, the tick of the old wall clock filling the space between her words. My sister nodded quickly, too quickly, as though she'd already been rehearsing her part. Yes, before he realizes, we can list it quietly. That word, they meant me. The property in question wasn't just land. It was my father's land. Acres of stubborn soil he had turned with his hands, back when money was thin, but pride was thicker. I had spent decades keeping it alive, paying taxes, trimming back neglect when no one else cared to lift a hand. And yet here they were, plotting to sell it from under me, as if my work had been invisible. I stepped into the kitchen, finally letting the floorboard creak under my weight. My mother stiffened. My sister's face went pale. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just looked at them. A look can say more than any protest. "Coffee's cold," I said simply, setting my hand on the back of a chair. My voice carried the low gravel of age, but also the edge of something that made them glance at each other. They mumbled excuses. My mother fussed with the sugar bowl. My sister shifted in her seat. I said nothing more. I didn't need to. But in that silence, I made a decision. If they wanted to sell it before I found out, then I would buy it before they ever saw the offer. That thought settled into me like an iron weight, solid and cold. And unlike them, I wouldn't whisper it. I would simply do it. The kitchen clock ticked on, and the smell of coffee lingered. But something inside me shifted permanently that day. Because betrayal doesn't always come with shouts. Sometimes it comes with a whisper. And I had heard enough to know it was time to act. I didn't sleep much that night. The house creaked in its old ways, pipes groaning, the porch flag tapping against the wood. But my thoughts were louder than any noise. I kept hearing that whisper, over and over. Sell it before she finds out. My mother's voice, a voice that had soothed me when I was a boy, now pressed like a knife against my ribs. I sat in my chair by the window, watching the branches move against the night sky. My father had built that porch, with his own hands, plank by plank, the way men of his generation did everything, with sweat and with silence. He never believed in shortcuts. He believed in permanence. That property, the land they wanted to sell, wasn't just dirt. It was the last place where his boot print still lived. Even after the storms, even after the weeds, there were traces of him in every corner. I knew the way the soil smelled after a rain, thick with the scent of iron and clay. I knew the tree lines, the hidden creek, the stones he had pulled from the earth one by one. My father used to tell me, "Land doesn't betray you, son. Only people do." He was right. I remembered the years after his death. The taxes came and no one else lifted a finger. My sister called it just numbers on paper and said she couldn't afford to help. My mother said she was too old to deal with it, so I paid. Every year, without complaint, I signed the checks. I repaired fences, replaced roofs, rented out portions just to keep the land alive. I told myself it was for them as much as it was for me. That's how family works, or so I believed. But family, I learned, is only as honest as their greed allows them to be. That night, as the clock hands moved toward midnight, I made a quiet vow. If they wanted to erase me, I would carve myself deeper into the story, not with noise, not with threats, but with the same patience my father taught me when he made me dig holes for fence posts as a boy, 1 inch at a time. Slow, steady, unshakable. Morning kamehevit. The sun rose through the blinds, laying stripes of light across the living room. I brewed coffee, black and bitter, and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had heard my mother's whisper. The wood still held the faint scent of lemon polish, the same as the night before, but everything else felt changed. When my sister came by later, she avoided my eyes. She busied herself with papers, making small talk about nothing. I let her. I asked no questions. Silence unnerves people more than anger. And sure enough, her words stumbled, her hands trembled as she gathered her things. "Going into town?" I asked finally. My voice calm, too calm. She blinked. Yes, just errands. I nodded, and she left. I knew what those errands were. She was speaking to a realtor. I could see it in her rushed step, the way her purse bulged with folders. They were moving faster than I thought. Good. That meant I had to move faster still. I took my coffee to the porch and watched the morning roll out over the land. The fields were golden with late summer light, the barn casting a long shadow. Birds moved in quick arcs above the trees. It was all so familiar, yet suddenly fragile. I realized then, if I did nothing, this view would belong to someone else. Strangers. And my father's work would be gone, sold cheap, parceled off, forgotten. That wouldn't happen. I pulled out my old leather notebook, the one I used for every serious matter. The cover was cracked, the pages lined with neat handwriting from decades past. I turned to a clean sheet and wrote just 4 words. Buy it before them. The plan would take shape quietly. I had resources not limitless, but enough. I had contacts from my years at the bank. I knew how transactions worked, how papers moved before signatures dried. I would need to be invisible, patient, deliberate, and most of all, I would need to be silent, because silence is the one weapon they never see coming. As I closed the notebook, I thought again of my father. I could almost hear his voice on the wind. Land doesn't betray you, son. Only people do. I sipped my coffee and let the bitterness settle on my tongue. The betrayal had already begun, but so had my answer. The next time they whispered, I wouldn't be standing in the doorway. I'd already be holding the deed. The story of that land didn't begin with betrayal. It began with sacrifice. I was 12 when my father first put a shovel in my hands. The soil was heavy, dark with moisture, clinging to the metal as if it didn't want to let go. He told me to dig a straight trench for the fence line. I remember my arms shaking by the time I'd gone 10 feet, sweat dripping into my eyes. I muttered something about it being too hard. He just looked at me, the kind of look that doesn't need words, and kept working beside me. By the time the sun set, the trench was finished. My palms were blistered, but something inside me had hardened too. That land wasn't easy, but it was ours. And when something is yours, you carry it no matter how heavy it gets. That lesson stayed with me. After my father passed, I carried more than just memories. I carried the tax bills that arrived like clockwork every spring. My sister would sigh dramatically when I asked for her share, as though numbers on a page were beyond her understanding. My mother would change the subject, claiming her pension barely covered groceries. So I paid. Quietly, year after year, I signed my name where theirs should have been. I didn't complain, not out loud. I told myself it was the right thing to do. Family comes first. That was the creed my father lived by. When the roof of the barn caved in one winter, under the weight of ice, I was the one up there with hammer and nails. When the fence posts rotted, I dug new holes and set new ones. When renters fell behind, it was me who stood in their doorway, hat in hand, finding compromise rather than conflict. My life bent around that property like a tree leaning toward light. I remember one summer, the drought was so bad, the ground split open. The fields looked like a cracked plate. My neighbors cursed the sky, and my sister suggested we just let the land go. Sell it, she said then too. It's not worth the sweat. But I stood out there with the hose, moving it inch by inch, trying to keep the young orchard alive. I can still feel the heat of that sun baking the back of my neck, the smell of dust rising with every step. Half the trees died anyway, but the half that lived, they bore fruit the following year. That mattered to me, because when you fight for something, it remembers. Over time, people in town began to forget whose land it was. They just called it Raymond's place. They saw me mowing it, repairing it, living it. My mother still called it the family property, but only in the way people claim a painting they never bought, or a meal they never cooked. My sister rarely even visited, except on holidays. Yet now she and my mother wanted to sell it, to pocket the value, as though their absence had earned them something. The hypocrisy of it gnawed at me, but I didn't show it. Silence is stronger than outrage. Outrage burns fast. Silence endures. There was one winter I'll never forget. The pipes froze in the main house, and the furnace gave out. My mother refused to stay there, said it was too cold, too miserable. My sister wouldn't step foot on the property if it didn't mean a paycheck. So I lived in that house alone, stoking fires day and night, eating canned soup by candlelight. I kept the place alive because it was the only thing left that tied me to my father. And now they whispered about selling it, before I even knew. I could almost laugh at the absurdity. They had abandoned the land for decades, left the burden to me, and then had the audacity to cut me from the prize. But betrayal rarely comes from strangers. It comes from those who share your name, those whose faces sit across from you at Christmas dinner. I look back at my life and realize something. I had been preparing for this moment all along. Every bill paid, every repair made, every silent sacrifice was a ledger entry. And in the end, ledgers balance. The world may not keep score, but I do. That's why the betrayal stung deeper than anger. Because in my heart, I had always believed that someday my patience would be acknowledged. That when the time came, my mother and sister would see clearly what I had done for them, for us, that they would honor it. Instead, they whispered in a kitchen, plotting to erase me. The irony is that my silence had made me invisible to them. They mistook patience for weakness, sacrifice for irrelevance. They thought the man who kept his head down, who never argued, who never asked for thanks, was a man they could simply brush aside. But they forgot one thing. A man who can endure in silence can also strike in silence. And I had every intention of showing them that lesson. I remember a night 30 years ago when the bank nearly took it all. The property taxes had stacked higher than I could manage. I was barely making enough from my job at the time, and my wife had just had surgery. Money was thinner than a razor's edge. My sister didn't answer my calls, and my mother claimed she had nothing to give. So I sat in the bank manager's office, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the smell of paper and ink sharp in my nose. The man across the desk drummed his fingers. "Raymond, you're in a bind," he said, as though I didn't already know. "If you can't make this payment, foreclosure is the next step." I could feel the sweat between my shoulder blades. My father's face rose in my mind, not smiling, not warm, but firm. He would never forgive me if I let the land go. I signed papers that night, papers that tied me to another decade of payments. I worked nights, weekends, every hour I could find. My knuckles cracked from the labor, my back ached every morning, but I never told a soul, and I paid it off, alone. My sister never knew the weight of those nights. My mother never asked. They lived in comfort while I lived in sacrifice, and I told myself that was enough, because someone had to carry the legacy, and apparently that someone was me. I thought about that often as the years rolled forward. The way sacrifice becomes invisible to those who don't make it. They see only the outcome, never the cost. My sister would visit on holidays, coo about how the place looks so nice, and then drive back to her tidy suburban home. My mother would complain about the draft, the old windows, the creaks in the floor, never once acknowledging that the only reason the house still stood was because I patched the roof at midnight during rainstorms, because I shoveled snow until my lungs burned. I can still hear the sound of nails being hammered into frozen wood, the sting in my fingers as blood returned after hours in the cold. I can still taste the cheap instant coffee I drank to stay awake during long nights of repair. Those memories are etched into the beams and floorboards, as much as my father's handprints once were. It's strange. For years, I believed they didn't thank me because they didn't know. That if they truly understood the hours, the money, the broken bones, and lost sleep, they would finally respect me. But the truth is harder than that. They knew, and they didn't care. That realization doesn't hit like thunder. It's quieter, more insidious. It creeps in when you least expect it, like a draft under a locked door. And once it's there, it never leaves. So when I heard my mother whisper about selling the land before I found out, it wasn't just betrayal, it was confirmation. Proof that all those years of sacrifice meant nothing to them. Proof that, in their eyes, I had always been expendable. But they had miscalculated one thing. Silence doesn't mean blindness. And patience doesn't mean surrender. In the stillness of those nights, patching roofs, crunching numbers, staring at overdue bills, I learned something no book or sermon could teach. I learned how to endure, how to bend without breaking, how to wait for the exact right moment to act. And that endurance, that patience, it would be the same weapon I'd use against them. I started small. Quiet research, checking the public records, scanning the property deed, reviewing the tax history. Old habits from my banking days returned like muscle memory. Every number told a story, and stories always have an ending. I didn't breathe a word of it. At family dinners, I smiled politely while they spoke of vacations, of shopping, of everything that didn't matter. My silence unnerved them sometimes, I could tell. My sister would ask if I was feeling all right. My mother would fuss, wondering why I was so quiet. But silence is how you measure people. Give them enough of it, and they reveal themselves. Late one evening, as I walked the property line under a pale moon, I paused by the oak tree my father had planted when I was a boy. Its roots had spread deep into the soil, thick and unyielding. I set my hand against its bark and thought, they don't know it yet, but I am that tree. They would try to sell, to cut me away, but when the dust settled, I would still be here. Not because of noise, not because of confrontation, but because I had already lived a lifetime of endurance, and endurance always wins. I left the oak tree that night with a decision hardening in me like stone. The betrayal had sealed my course, but the years of sacrifice had already written the blueprint. I would strike quietly, and when I did, they would never see it coming. The betrayal didn't come with a storm. It came with envelopes. I found the first one on the kitchen counter, a white folder, carelessly left half open, the realtor's letterhead crisp and unmistakable. My sister must have dropped it while pretending to fetch sugar for my mother's tea. They thought they were clever, slipping papers past me. But careless hands always leave trails. I opened it, slow and deliberate, as though I were inspecting a stranger's will. The words were simple: listing price, projected buyers, commission fees. And at the bottom, in black ink, were two names written clearly: my mother, my sister. Mine was nowhere to be found. It's a strange thing to see your absence on paper, to see your life reduced to a blank line. I stood there in the quiet kitchen, the smell of tea leaves faint in the air, and let the weight of it press down. This wasn't just talk anymore. This was action. They had already spoken to a realtor. They had already set things in motion. And all the while, they smiled at me across the dinner table, as if nothing were happening. Later that week, I followed the trail further. Phone calls hushed when I entered the room. Conversations cut short. My sister's car parked outside the realtor's office on Main Street, the afternoon sun glaring against its windshield. I stayed across the street, leaning against a lamppost, pretending to scan the headlines at the newspaper stand. But my eyes were on the glass door, and when she stepped out clutching a fresh packet of papers, I knew. They weren't waiting, they weren't asking, they were erasing. The irony was sharp. For decades, I'd been the one signing the checks, filing the documents, making sure the county never came knocking with liens or penalties. I had kept the property afloat through recessions, droughts, and more family excuses than I could count. And now, when the land finally had value, when buyers circled with hungry eyes, I was to be cut away like an old branch no longer bearing fruit. That night, I sat at the old oak desk in my study, the lamp throwing a yellow circle across the papers I'd gathered. My hands rested on the wood, steady despite the fire inside me. I had always believed betrayal would feel like fury, but what I felt was colder, cleaner, a kind of quiet clarity. They thought I would fight with noise, that I would confront, argue, plead. But they didn't understand me. They never had. I remembered a moment from years earlier, my father teaching me how to mend wire fencing. The metal had snapped under pressure, jagged edges curling like teeth. I wanted to fix it quickly, to twist it back together, but he shook his head. No, son, you don't rush. You study the break. You measure twice. You move once. That lesson sat with me now, heavier than the betrayal itself. I studied the break. The break was not the property. It was not even the realtor's papers. The break was the trust between mother and son, between siblings. And like any break, it needed to be addressed with precision. The next morning, I found my mother in the parlor, knitting in her chair. The needles clicked softly, the scent of lavender sachets clinging to the air. She looked up when I entered, her smile too quick, too rehearsed. "Morning, Raymond," she said, as though the whisper I had overheard, the papers I had seen, were figments of my imagination. I nodded and sat across from her. For a long while, I said nothing. Just let the needles click, click, click. Finally, I asked, "You've been to see a realtor?" Her hands faltered, just once. Then she recovered. "Your sister thought it was best. The place is too much for us to manage. Us." The word nearly made me laugh. There had never been an us in the work, only me. I didn't press further. I simply watched her, the way one might watch a stranger walking across familiar ground. She looked down at her knitting, unable to meet my gaze, and in that silence, I knew more than her words could ever admit. They were going through with it. That evening, my sister stopped by. She carried herself like someone bracing for a fight, but her tone was honeyed. "Ray, we just want what's fair," she said, placing her hand on my shoulder. "You know it's time to let go, lettre." As if letting go were easy, as if letting go were natural after a lifetime of sacrifice. I simply removed her hand and walked away. Her sigh followed me, frustrated, convinced I was being stubborn. But it wasn't stubbornness, it was calculation. They thought betrayal had ended the story. What they didn't know was that it had only written the beginning of mine, because betrayal has a peculiar effect on men like me. It doesn't break us, it sharpens us. And sharpened men cut deep without ever raising their voice. The final confirmation came on a Wednesday afternoon. I was walking past the dining room when I heard voices carry from inside. My mother and sister sat close together, the realtor's folder spread open between them. The smell of ink and paper filled the room. Contracts always smell like finality. My mother adjusted her glasses, tracing her finger down the page. "So, once it's listed, he doesn't need to be involved at all?" she asked. Her voice carried the practiced innocence of someone trying to sound ignorant, though I knew better. The realtor, a slick man with a voice like polished stone, nodded. "Not if the deed's already in your names. We can fast-track this before anyone else intervenes." Anyone else. That phrase twisted in my gut. In their eyes, I wasn't family. I was anyone else. My sister leaned forward, her tone low, conspiratorial. "Good, because if Raymond finds out, he'll just drag his feet. He always has this sentimental nonsense about Dad's land." She chuckled, shaking her head. "It's just dirt. Valuable dirt, but dirt all the same." I stayed in the hallway, unseen. The wallpaper there was faded, the same pattern from my childhood, when I used to run my fingers along it while racing to the dinner table. Now I leaned against it, steadying myself as though the house itself were trying to hold me upright. My mother sighed, her knitting basket resting by her chair. "He's always been too attached. That's why we need to do this quietly." Quietly. That word used as their weapon. I let their voices fade into the clatter of teacups and rustle of papers. I didn't step in, didn't confront. Confrontation is loud, and loudness is a confession. Instead, I walked to the porch and sat in the old rocker, letting the boards creak beneath me. The evening light stretched across the fields, soft and golden. My father's land, the one they reduced to dirt. As I rocked slowly, I thought of him again. He'd had rough hands, scarred from years of work, but steady as stone. He once told me, "When someone tries to cheat you, son, don't shout, don't swing. Outlast them. The land teaches patience. Use it." Patience. That word fit me like an old coat. I stayed patient through the next days, watching them make their moves. My sister on the phone, whispering in corners. My mother writing notes, slipping them into envelopes. I saw every detail, though they thought I was blind. That's the thing about underestimating a man who doesn't speak. You mistake silence for absence. At night, I walked the fields. The crickets sang, the air smelled of hay and earth, and the moon cast a silver glow on the barns. Each step reminded me of what was at stake. This wasn't just property. It was every sacrifice I had ever made. Every night I went without so the land could endure. And now, in their greed, they tried to erase me from it. One evening, my sister cornered me in the kitchen. Her voice was soft, but her eyes were sharp. "Ray, listen, this is for the best. You don't need to worry yourself with all the paperwork. Let us handle it. You've done enough. You've done enough." The word stung worse than any insult. Done enough? I had carried it all. They had done nothing, and now they wanted to erase me with a pat on the shoulder and a smile. I looked at her, my face calm, my voice even. "If that's what you think?" "Ah!" Her brows furrowed, searching for anger, maybe for protest. But there was none. Just silence. Silence unnerved her, the way it always did. She left the room unsettled, muttering something about me being stubborn. That night, I opened my leather notebook again. The same page stared back at me. Buy it before them. The betrayal had reached its peak. They had set the fire, and now it was my turn to control the flames. I began making calls, not loud, not obvious. Old contacts from the bank, men who owed me favors, a lawyer who still respected my discretion. Quiet inquiries, carefully worded. I asked about timelines, about structures, about ways to move before anyone else. Each answer tightened the outline of a plan in my mind. They thought they were silent, but I had been silent longer. And my silence wasn't the absence of words. It was the sharpening of a blade. When the moment came, they would learn that betrayal doesn't end with whispers in a kitchen. It ends with signatures they never saw coming. The first step of revenge is not rage. It is paperwork. I knew that better than most. My years in the bank had taught me how money moved, how property changed hands, how a signature in the right place could outweigh 1,000 shouts in the street. And so, I didn't storm into the dining room to confront them. I went to town. The courthouse was quiet that morning. Dust motes floated in the shafts of light that cut through the tall windows. The clerk, a tired woman with half-moon glasses, barely looked up when I approached her desk. But when I asked for property records, she shuffled the files with an efficiency born of repetition. There it was. The deed. My father's land listed under my mother's and father's names. My name absent, of course, but my memory attached to every line of it. The taxes, the liens, the payments, all handled by me, though the ink gave me no credit. I traced the outline of the document with my finger, calm and steady. This was the battlefield, not the kitchen, not the family table. This piece of paper. From there, I went to see Richard Lawson, a lawyer I'd known for decades. He was younger than me, ambitious when I first met him, but now gray had begun to salt his temples. When I stepped into his office, the smell of leather-bound books and fresh coffee filled the air. "Raymond," he said, rising to shake my hand, "haven't seen you in years. What brings you in?" I sat across from him, folding my hands neatly in my lap. "I need discretion," I said. My voice was calm, measured, but there was steel underneath. He nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Always." I laid it out, piece by piece. How my family had already spoken to a realtor. How they planned to sell the land behind my back. How my decades of sacrifice had been reduced to nothing in their eyes. His jaw tightened as he listened, but he didn't interrupt. When I finished, he leaned back, steepling his fingers. "You want to stop the sale?" "No," I corrected. "I want to buy it before they sell it." His brow arched, but he didn't smile. He knew better than to treat this as humor. "Quietly, then?" As quietly as the grave, I said. For the next hour, we mapped the terrain. A holding company, simple and unremarkable, would be formed in my name but shielded by layers of paperwork. The bid would be structured in cash enough to end the realtor's appetite for delays. Timing was everything. We needed to move before the listing went public. Richard scribbled notes, his pen scratching softly against the yellow pad. "If we do this right, they won't know until the ink is dry." Exactly, I said. Walking out of that office, the sunlight felt sharper, as though the world itself had tilted slightly in my favor. I didn't feel triumphant, not yet, but I felt aligned, like a stone finally set into its proper place. That evening, back at the house, my sister was there again. She sat with my mother, voices low, papers stacked neatly in front of them. When I entered, they both stiffened. I gave them a small nod, poured myself a glass of water, and left them to their plotting. I didn't need to interrupt. I already knew what they were planning, and while they thought they were weaving threads in secret, I had already laid the foundation for a net they couldn't escape. Later that night, as I sat in my study, I pulled out my father's old pocket watch. The silver had dulled, scratches worn into its case from years of use. I clicked it open, listening to the tick. My father had carried this watch through years of hardship, through storms and droughts and debt. To him, time was not the enemy. It was the ally of men who could endure. That was my inheritance, more than the land, more than the house. Patience, endurance, the ability to wait in silence until the moment was ripe. And now, time itself was on my side, because they thought silence was my weakness. They thought it meant I was passive, blind, unwilling. But silence, in truth, was my strongest blade. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly, and let the quiet of the house surround me. My mother and sister were in the next room, whispering and plotting. The papers they shuffled meant nothing compared to the papers Richard and I would prepare. Let them whisper. Let them scheme. By the time they learned the truth, the land would already belong to me, and they would discover that the man they ignored, the man they dismissed, had been watching, waiting, and moving all along. The hardest part of revenge is not the strike. It's the waiting. I had everything in motion. The holding company registered, Richard drafting the bid, funds prepared to move at a moment's notice. Yet in the days that followed, I had to sit under the same roof as my mother and sister, listening to them whisper and laugh like conspirators who believed they had already won. It's a peculiar kind of torture, to hear your own erasure discussed in the casual tone of afternoon tea. My sister talked about what she'd do with the money. A trip to Europe, she said. Maybe a new kitchen remodel. My mother just nodded along, as though the land meant no more to her than an old chair she'd grown tired of. I sat at the table with them, sipping my coffee. I didn't argue. I didn't even look up from the newspaper. That silence was my shield, and like all shields, it made them careless, because they thought silence meant surrender. 2 days later, Richard called. "They're pushing the listing. The realtor's paperwork will be finalized by Friday." "Good," I said. "Let's be quicker." We moved with precision. Richard filed the bid through the holding company, structured clean and simple, an offer no realtor with a commission-hungry heart could refuse. Cash on the table, no contingencies. It was the kind of offer that closed doors before they were even open. By Thursday evening, while my sister poured another round of wine for my mother, I was in Richard's office signing papers of my own. The air smelled of ink and coffee, and the lamp cast a warm glow over the contracts. My hand didn't shake as I signed. Each stroke of the pen felt like a hammer hitting steel. When I finished, Richard stacked the papers neatly and looked at me with the faintest smile. "Ray, by the time they wake up tomorrow, this land will already be yours." I nodded once, and they'll never have seen it coming. Driving home, the night air was cool against my face. The headlights cut through the dark road, and for the first time in weeks I felt something loosen inside me. Not joy, not triumph, just release. Like a man who's carried a weight so long he forgot what it meant to breathe without it. When I walked through the door, my sister was on the phone in the kitchen. Her laughter carried, sharp and careless. My mother was in her chair, knitting as though nothing in the world could touch her. Neither of them looked up at me. They didn't notice the papers in my briefcase. They didn't sense the shift that had already occurred. And why would they? They had always underestimated me. That night, I stood at the window of my study, looking out over the dark fields. The land stretched under the moonlight, familiar and eternal. Mine in all but ink, and now, mine in ink as well. I let the quiet wash over me, the hum of crickets, the faint rustle of trees. This was the moment my father had prepared me for without ever saying it. Not the land itself, but the lesson. The patience to endure, the will to act when the time was right. The silence to move unseen until the deed was done. I thought of the old oak tree again, its roots sunk deep, unshakable. I was that tree. And while they schemed above the surface, I had already dug deeper. The next morning, my mother and sister left early, dressed neatly, their faces lit with anticipation. They thought they were meeting the realtor to push things forward. They thought the day was theirs. They didn't know the papers were already signed, the sale already sealed. By noon, Richard called to confirm. "It's done, Ray, official. They'll find out soon enough." I thanked him and hung up, leaning back in my chair. The house was quiet. Too quiet, except for the steady tick of my father's pocket watch on the desk. I clicked it open, watched the hands move, and let myself smile a small, private smile. Because timing is everything. And this time, the timing was mine. The downfall began in a realtor's office. I wasn't there, but I didn't need to be. I could picture it clearly, my mother and sister sitting prim and ready, faces bright with the thrill of betrayal. My sister with her pen poised, my mother with her glasses perched at the edge of her nose. The realtor laying the papers out, rehearsing his polished lines. Then the moment, the line item, the shift in tone. "Ah, it appears the property has already been sold." I imagine the pause, the silence thickening like smoke. My sister leaning forward, confusion flashing in her eyes. My mother blinking rapidly, knitting fingers suddenly restless without the comfort of yarn. "What do you mean, already sold?" my sister would demand, her voice sharp with disbelief. And the realtor, fumbling now, flipping through documents, explaining how a cash offer had come through, clean and unassailable. The kind of offer that closes doors without knocking. He'd clear his throat, say something about the efficiency of the transaction. He'd assure them there must have been some miscommunication. But there wasn't. Because the communication was perfect. It just wasn't with them. That afternoon, I was sitting on the porch when my sister's car screeched into the driveway. Gravel sprayed beneath the tires, her face pale behind the windshield. She slammed the door and stormed toward me, papers clutched in her hand like weapons. "You knew," she spat, waving the documents. Her voice cracked, a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You knew about this!" I looked up from my coffee, the steam curling in the air. My face was calm, my voice even. "Knew what?" She nearly choked on her fury. "Don't play dumb, Raymond. The land, it's gone. Sold. And the buyer..." She cut herself short, realizing perhaps a second too late. I let the silence hang, heavy and deliberate. Then I leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking beneath me, and said simply, "Good thing it's not strangers, then." Her eyes widened, the realization dawning. The color drained from her face. "You," she whispered, as if the word itself were poison. Behind her, my mother emerged slowly from the car. She didn't shout, didn't accuse. She just looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and something deeper, perhaps recognition. Recognition that the son she had dismissed, underestimated, ignored, had been the one to outmaneuver her. My sister wasn't quiet. She hurled words at me, sharp and frantic. "How could you do this? After everything? That land was supposed to..." She stopped herself again, but I knew what she meant. Supposed to be theirs, supposed to line their pockets. pay for their comforts, supposed to erase me. I sipped my coffee and set it down gently. The land was never yours to give away, I said softly. You just thought it was. Her hands trembled, crumpling the papers. She looked at my mother for support, but my mother stayed silent. Her eyes never left mine, and in that silence, something shifted. For the first time, she seemed to see me not as the quiet son in the corner, but as the man who had carried everything they'd abandoned. The rest of that day unfolded like a slow-motion play. My sister stormed through the house muttering curses under her breath, slamming doors. My mother sat in her chair, staring at nothing. I went about my routine, fed the fire, tidied the kitchen, stepped outside to watch the sun dip behind the fields. The land looked the same, golden and endless, but the balance of power had changed entirely. The next morning, my sister tried a different tactic. She cornered me in the hallway, her voice quieter now, almost pleading. Ray, listen, we could have worked together. We could have shared. Why cut us out? I studied her face, the desperation creeping in where arrogance once lived. You never included me, I said. Not once. You erased me before I ever put pen to paper. She swallowed hard, realizing the truth in that. My mother, to her credit, didn't beg. She simply asked one question that evening, her voice steady though her hands shook. You planned this, didn't you? I met her gaze. I endured this. I corrected. She looked away then, the weight of her own choices settling over her like a shroud. That night, I walked the property line again. The moonlight silvered the grass, and the air smelled of hay. Each step felt lighter now, unburdened. The land was mine, secured not by noise, not by conflict, but by the same quiet patience that had carried me all these years. Their downfall wasn't dramatic. It wasn't screaming or fists or broken glass. It was the slow collapse of certainty. The realization that every whispered plan, every secretive glance, had been outmaneuvered by the very silence they dismissed. And in that quiet collapse, I found my justice. The days that followed were thick with tension. My sister avoided me at first, slamming doors, retreating into her phone calls, venting to anyone who would listen. I could hear her voice through the thin walls, sharp and brittle. He tricked us. He planned this the whole time. It isn't fair. Fair. That word almost made me laugh. What was fair about decades of sacrifice laid at my feet while they contributed nothing? What was fair about being erased from documents, from conversations, from the very legacy I had preserved? No, fairness had never been the currency between us. Silence had been. And silence had carried interest. My mother's response was different. She didn't rage. She didn't call anyone. She simply grew quieter, her knitting lying untouched on the side table, her gaze drifting often toward the window. I wondered if she saw my father out there in the fields, if his memory sat heavier on her now that the land was no longer hers to barter away. One evening, she finally spoke. I was on the porch, the air cool, the horizon painted with the last hues of sunset. She stepped out slowly, leaning on the railing. For a long time, we said nothing. The crickets began their song, and the boards beneath us creaked with age. Then she asked, almost in a whisper, "Did you hate me for it?" The question sat between us like a stone. I turned toward her, studying the lines in her face, the weariness in her eyes. Hate? Number hate was too loud, too consuming. What I felt was quieter, heavier. I didn't hate you, I said finally, but I remembered every word, every silence, and I carried it. She nodded slowly, as if she expected nothing less. Her hands gripped the railing, knuckles pale. For once, she didn't argue, didn't excuse. She simply let the weight of it hang in the night air. My sister, however, wasn't done. She tried a new angle, guilt. "You've ruined us," she hissed one afternoon, cornering me in the hallway. "Do you realize what you've done? That money could have changed everything for us." I looked at her calmly, my voice steady. It already did. It changed everything for me. Her lips trembled, fury and disbelief colliding in her eyes, but there was nothing left for her to grasp. The papers were signed. The deed was mine. Her words, her anger, her desperation, none of it could change the ink that already bound the land to me. And so slowly her fight drained away. That's the thing about downfall, it doesn't always come as fire and ruin. Sometimes it comes as silence. As the slow dawning realization that the game is already over, that the pieces were moved long before you ever sat at the table, I watched it happen day by day. The way my sister's phone calls grew shorter, less frequent. The way her voice lost its sharpness, replaced by something duller, heavier. The way my mother stopped asking questions, her eyes turning inward, as though she were searching the past for a moment when things might have been different. But there was no different. There was only this. And I felt no need to gloat, no need to remind them of what they had lost. Their own silence was reminder enough. Instead, I went about my days as I always had, tending the land, walking the fields, repairing what needed to be repaired. The difference was subtle but absolute. For the first time, I did it knowing the land was wholly mine, not just in effort but in fact. One morning, I stood at the edge of the orchard, the air sweet with ripening fruit. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves whispering secrets older than all of us. I thought of my father then, of his voice, his hands, his lessons. He had been right all along. The land doesn't betray you. Only people do, and people had betrayed me. But the land was still here, because I had kept it, because I had endured. Their downfall wasn't just losing the land. It was realizing that the very silence they mocked was the silence that undid them. That the son they dismissed, the brother they underestimated, was the one who held the deed while they held nothing. When I came back to the house that evening, my sister sat at the table, staring at nothing, her wineglass untouched. My mother sat beside her, knitting finally in her lap again, though the needles didn't move. The air was heavy with unspoken words. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the sound loud in the silence, and sat across from them. Neither of them met my eyes, and in that silence, their downfall was complete. The morning after their silence settled, I rose early. The house was still, the air cool with a smell of dew drifting through the open window. I brewed coffee in the old pot, the one my father used to set on the stove after long days in the fields. The sound of it percolating was steady, grounding. Outside, the land stretched in a golden hush, the sun just beginning to tip over the horizon. I stepped out onto the porch, mug in hand, and breathed deep. The fields, the orchard, the barn, all of it mine now, beyond argument, beyond betrayal. The papers had spoken louder than their whispers ever could. It struck me then how quiet victory can be. There were no parades, no applause, no grand gestures, just the steady pulse of the earth under my boots and the knowledge that I had endured where others faltered. Later that day, my sister left. She didn't slam the door this time. She just packed her things into her car, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She muttered something about needing space as she passed me in the hallway. I didn't stop her. I didn't wish her well. I simply stepped aside and let her go. My mother stayed. She moved slower these days, her strength waning. But she stayed in her chair by the window, knitting when she could, staring out when she couldn't. Sometimes I caught her watching me as I crossed the yard, her eyes lingering with a mixture of regret and something unspoken. One evening, she called me into the parlor. The air smelled faintly of lavender, the last light of day spilling across the floorboards. She held the deed in her hands, the official copy I'd left on the table weeks before. "You wanted this all along," she said, her voice soft, almost tired. I sat across from her, folding my hands on my knees. "I wanted it safe," I said. "Safe from being sold off. Safe from being forgotten. That's all." Her eyes searched mine as though she wanted to argue but couldn't. Instead, she nodded slowly. "Your father would have been proud." The words struck deeper than any anger ever could, because in that moment, I realized this wasn't about winning against them. It was about keeping faith with him. The man who had dug the trenches, built the fences, taught me that silence could outlast storms. That night, I walked the property line again. The moon was high, the air cool against my skin. I stopped by the oak tree, its roots thick and gnarled, its branches stretching wide into the night sky. I set my hand against its bark, rough beneath my palm, and let the silence sink in. For years, I had carried the weight of sacrifice. For months, I had carried the sting of betrayal. Now, at last, I carried nothing. I thought of the whispers I had overheard in the kitchen, the papers I had seen, the voices that had dismissed me. And then I thought of the sound of the pen, scratching across Richard's desk, the weight of the deed in my hands, the steady tick of my father's pocket watch. Whispers fade, ink endures. When I returned to the house, the lights were dim. My mother had fallen asleep in her chair, her knitting needles resting quietly in her lap. I covered her with a blanket, my movements silent, and then poured myself another cup of coffee. I stood at the window, looking out across the fields, and felt something settle in me. Not triumph, not even satisfaction, just peace. Because in the end, revenge isn't always fire and fury. Sometimes it's the quiet sound of a door closing, of papers filed, of land secured. Sometimes it's simply the knowledge that those who whispered against you can no longer touch what matters most. And for me, that was enough. Weeks passed, and the house grew quieter still. My sister stopped visiting. The calls, the accusations, the pleading, they all faded into silence. Perhaps she finally understood that there was nothing left to win, or perhaps she simply couldn't stand the reminder of what she had lost. Either way, her absence didn't sting. If anything, it felt like a weight lifting. My mother remained, but something in her had shifted. She no longer spoke of selling, no longer dropped hints about the burden of the land. Instead, she spent her days in her chair by the window, knitting slow, uneven rows. Sometimes she watched me in the yard, her eyes soft, unreadable. I never asked what she was thinking. Some silences are best left unbroken. Life returned to rhythm. Mornings with coffee on the porch, afternoons tending to fences or walking the orchard, evenings spent with the hum of crickets and the faint rustle of wind through the fields. The land responded, as it always had. Grass grew tall, the trees bore fruit, the soil breathed beneath my boots, and in that rhythm, I found peace. One afternoon, as I walked the property line, I saw a for sale sign half buried in the ditch. My sister must have dropped it in her haste, or perhaps she threw it there when the truth hit her. I pulled it from the weeds, the wood damp, the letters fading. I leaned it against the old barn and left it there, a reminder of their downfall, and of my endurance. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years I had believed my silence made me invisible. But in the end, silence made me inevitable. Because while they whispered in kitchens and scribbled in secret, I was patient. While they underestimated, I endured. And when the moment came, I struck not with rage, but with ink, the quietest weapon of all. I often thought of my father in those days. His lessons, his voice, the way he carried himself with dignity, even when life gave him little in return. I wondered what he would have said if he'd seen me sitting at Richard's desk, pen in hand, reclaiming what was his. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps just a nod, because men like him and like me understand that silence speaks loudest when it's backed by action. One evening, I sat with my mother on the porch. The air was warm, the horizon painted in streaks of orange and red. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "You've won, Raymond." I shook my head. There was never a game to win, only something to protect. She sighed, her shoulders sinking. Maybe that's where I went wrong. I thought survival meant letting go. You thought it meant holding on. Neither of us said more. The crickets filled the silence, the wood of the porch groaning softly beneath our chairs. She didn't apologize, and I didn't ask her to. Some wounds don't need words, they just need time. When the sun dipped below the fields, I stood and looked out across the land. My land. The trees swayed in the evening breeze, the orchard darkening with shadows, the barn a silhouette against the sky. It wasn't victory that filled me, it wasn't pride, it was something deeper, something steadier. It was belonging. I turned back to the house, where the lights glowed warm against the dusk. My mother still sat in her chair, her knitting needles finally moving again, clicking softly in the rhythm of her hands. For the first time in months, I smiled. Not a broad smile, not triumphant, just the quiet curve of a man who has carried a burden, endured betrayal, and still stands. Because in the end, revenge didn't need to shout. It didn't need to burn. It just needed to endure longer than their schemes, to hold steady until their whispers collapsed under their own weight. And as I closed the door behind me, the house settling into silence, I realized something with absolute clarity. Silence is not weakness. Silence is strength. And mine had outlasted them all.